Не слышно, скажите опять. Не слышно. Since the room is full, we can start. And I give the floor to our friends and colleagues. Ничего не слышно, не идет ничего сюда. When there are things that we don't know or know a little about, we rely on our friends and colleagues. Ничего не слышно вообще. We rely on our friends and colleagues with whom we cooperated for many years. And I give the floor to Tanya Lokshina. Thank you very much, Sasha. We are very grateful to Memorial for the opportunity to have here this presentation about the situation in Syria and the role that Russia is playing in the Syrian conflict. This is the second talk on Syria at Memorial in this room. When we had the first such lecture, Russia at that time, given that its role in the Syrian events was even then quite substantial, was not a direct participant in the conflict. But since that time, the situation has changed dramatically. And first of all, I would like to thank our interpreters, Pavel Palashenko and Alexei Prokorenko, without whom we wouldn't have been able to hold this gathering. They are working for free to give you a chance to discuss Syria here. I would like to introduce my colleagues, Lama Fakih and Sara Kayyali, who are responsible for Syrian research in our organization and who know the situation very well from within. Lama is Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch on Middle East and North Africa. Sara is the researcher who is working on Syria, and they will be talking for about 25 minutes, and following that you will have a chance to ask them specific questions or to make comments, maybe to debate the issues with them. We have today 90 minutes, and I thank you all for coming here tonight and for coming to discuss this important subject. So I give the floor to Lama, please.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to our hosts at Memorial for allowing us to have this conversation today in Moscow. I'm going to begin with an overview of our work, and then we're going to take a deeper dive into Russia's role in Syria today and the facts on the ground in Syria today. So Human Rights Watch, you are likely familiar with our reports and our statements in the press, but what is Human Rights Watch and how does Human Rights Watch work? Our methodology can really be summed up in 3 words: investigate, expose, and change. We investigate human rights abuses by uncovering what happened, why, and who is responsible. We do this by going to the places where the violations are taking place. And when we can't do that, by interviewing witnesses remotely and using innovative methods to corroborate their statements. We then expose our findings using reports, videos, the news, social media, any way that we can. And we push for change by advocating at the highest levels of government. Human Rights Watch has used this methodology in Syria since we began working on the country in the early 1990s. Prior to the current conflict, our work on Syria focused on repression of political and human rights activism, restrictions on freedom of expression, on torture, ill treatment, and enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention and the absence of fair trials, and also on the repression of the Kurdish minority in Syria. In March 2011, we saw that it was a number of these underlying human rights abuses by the government that sparked countrywide protests and eventually resulted in the entrenched conflict that we are all witnessing today. As the uprising turned conflict in Syria has languished on these past 7 years, Human Rights Watch has deployed extensive resources to document the violations perpetrated by all parties of the conflict there. We've deployed investigators to areas across the country, from Damascus to Homs to Idlib to Aleppo, Latakia, Hasakeh. We have conducted interviews with victims and witnesses. We've interviewed refugees in all countries neighboring Syria, as well as in North Africa and in Europe. And we have documented violations by every party, by government forces, pro-government militia, extremist groups like ISIS, a number of anti-government armed groups, Turkish forces, as well as US and US-led coalition forces and the Kurdish forces they back on the ground. We have also documented violations perpetrated by the Russian government in the context of their military operations in Syria. So if we take a look back, anti-government protests erupted in the southern governorate of Daraa in mid-March 2011. These protests quickly spread to other parts of the country, with security forces responding brutally to try and stamp out the dissent. These security forces launched large-scale military operations in towns across the country. They prevented ambulances from reaching wounded. They targeted medical personnel. They arrested injured protesters, including at hospitals, forcing many wounded to seek treatment in makeshift field hospitals. Key abuses that were characteristic of this time were unlawful killings of protesters and residents, arbitrary arrests, torture, detention, including of children, journalists, activists, and denial of medical assistance. It wasn't long before we were able to establish that these abuses were not isolated incidents, but rather systematic abuses ordered at the highest levels. In this report, By All Means Necessary, Individuals in Command Responsibility for Crimes Against Humanity in Syria, we documented the systematic nature of the orders to shoot at unarmed protesters and the command structure of the units responsible for the killing. In a follow-up report, Torture Archipelago, based on interviews with defectors from security forces and former detainees, we documented the security web containing tens of thousands of arbitrarily detained persons, people held for years, subjected to brutal torture, including sexual violence, in many cases with their families having no information about their fate or whereabouts, and with the detainees having no contact with the outside world. These detainees included students, youth, activists, journalists, humanitarians, and medics. In some cases, family members of wanted were targeted, including children. In follow-up reports, we also documented how a number of these activists were being prosecuted in unfair trials, including in military tribunals and before counterterrorism courts. And then in 2015, relying in part on evidence released by a defector named Caesar, we also showed how the government was conducting mass executions of detainees in detention. As abuses by the government and government allies escalated, the opposition in Syria also began to arm itself. And by the spring of 2012, we began documenting abuses by some of these groups. These abuses included executions, kidnappings, torture and detention, and arbitrary detention. At the same time, the humanitarian situation on the ground began to worsen, with some civilians not able to get basic levels of humanitarian assistance. By July 2012, the fighting had escalated to the point that the International Committee of the Red Cross declared that Syria was now in an internal armed conflict. As the conflict progressed, we saw the government take further steps to punish entire populations perceived to be anti-government. These violations included mass demolitions, You see in the images here, neighborhood in Damascus in 2013, both before and after mass demolitions of the area. This is just one of the areas that was affected. Collective punishment also included mass executions. Government forces conducted mass executions of civilians during military operations aimed at trying to take back territory that was being held by anti-government forces. And of course, they have also included the use of chemical weapons. On August 21st, 2013, we and the rest of the world were shocked to see the initial images of children and other civilians who were caught in a chemical weapons attack in Damascus countryside. This attack has been followed since by dozens of other chemical attacks in Syria. The government has also used other prohibited weapons in the context of their fighting in Syria. This has included cluster bombs and incendiary weapons, weapons that are incapable of being precise when used in populated civilian areas. Government abuses only increased as the fighting became heightened. From shelling, we began to see airstrikes. And in the context of military operations, we began to see indiscriminate strikes that were not distinguishing between combatants and civilians in areas held by anti-government forces across the country. The government popularized the use of barrel bombs. Again, imprecise, rudimentary weapons used in populated areas that struck civilian targets, including schools, hospitals, bread lines, homes, markets. The government also used weapons like ballistic missiles, weapons that have such a wide area effect that, again, they cannot be targeted when used in these populated areas. And across the country, starting in 2014, we saw that the government was pairing these unlawful measures alongside unlawful sieges and restrictions on humanitarian assistance, blocking the delivery of aid to civilians that needed it and blocking these civilians from fleeing areas of active fighting. This pairing facilitated the government's takeover of territory that was taken by anti-government groups, starting in 2014, first in Homs, then in Aleppo, and now, as we've seen in the past weeks, in Damascus countryside in eastern Ghouta. As the fighting continued, abuses by anti-government groups also proliferated. I mentioned already arbitrary detention and torture, but we also began documenting the use of child soldiers, the unlawful use of civilian infrastructure like schools for military objectives, the restrictions of aid going to civilians, discrimination and targeting of women and religious minorities, and the unlawful use of landmines to target civilians, as well as using civilians for human shields. From areas where anti-government groups were based, they also launched attacks into government-held territory, attacks that killed and maimed civilians. Some groups also used car bombs to target civilians in areas that the government was holding, targeting busy street centers, targeting schools, targeting residential areas. And in attempts to take territory from the government, anti-government groups also committed executions and widespread hostage-taking and kidnapping. In an offensive in August 2013, we documented mass executions and kidnapping of Alawite civilians. I was able to go to the villages that were affected weeks after the government had retaken the area and could see firsthand the devastation for the people that remained behind, that were trying to pick up their lives, trying to understand what had happened to over 200 civilians that were taken hostage, and trying to pick up the pieces as after over 190 had been killed. And as we all know, the conflict has only become increasingly deadly as it has become more internationalized. A US-backed coalition began conducting strikes in Syria in September 2014. We have documented instances in which US-led coalition forces did not take adequate precautions to protect civilians and to minimize civilian casualties. Kurdish security forces that are backed by the US-led coalition on the ground have also committed abuses. They have detained and harassed members of political opposition. They are responsible for torture and ill treatment, arbitrary detention, and unfair trials. In recent months, members of the Syrian Democratic Forces have also restricted the movement of displaced persons from the fighting in Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor. So what has been Russia's role in all of this? We know that the Russian government began conducting military operations in Syria on September 30th, 2015. But we also know that its role in Syria goes well beyond this. Alongside its direct military engagement, the government is assisting Syria by supplying them with weapons, as well as with diplomatic support at the UN and at negotiations. Russia has also played a role in providing humanitarian assistance and in reconciliation and rehabilitation projects in Syria. Russia's military engagement has come with a significant price tag, both in terms of the costs to the Russian government and people, but also because of the human rights violations that have taken place in the context of Russian-Syrian military offensives. This has impacted the lives of civilians on the ground in concrete and devastating ways, but it has also tarnished Russia's reputation globally. Since Russia began military operations in Syria, Russian-Syrian airstrikes have hit civilian infrastructures and caused hundreds of civilian casualties. Joint military operations have extensively used banned cluster munitions, in some cases Soviet-made, as well as incendiary weapons. And these are weapons that cause excruciatingly painful burns that are difficult to treat and start fires that destroy civilian property and are difficult to put out. There is compelling evidence that the Russian government aircraft have themselves delivered incendiary weapons in Syria, or at least have participated in incendiary weapon attacks delivered by the Syrian government. In 2016, Russian and Syrian forces bombarded parts of Aleppo, a city in northern Syria, held by anti-government groups at the time, including with indiscriminate barrel bombs, cluster munitions, and incendiary weapons. We have not been able to determine the extent to which the Russian government has been involved in the most recent offensive to retake eastern Ghouta in Damascus countryside. But media reports and statements from other government officials indicate that Russia was very closely involved in the offensive there. And in fact, that the government would not have been able to retake these areas without the critical Russian support. During this recent offensive, we did document airstrikes and the use of prohibited weapons, including clusters and incendiary weapons. And of course, the Syrian government continues to rely on Russia and Iran for its weaponry. Despite extensive evidence of violations perpetrated by the government, there is every indication that this support is continuing. In October 2015, Sana'a News, which is Syria's state media, reported that the Director General of Rosaborn Export, Russia's state-owned armed company, said that the Syrian-Russian military technical cooperation would continue and that Russia would continue to send weapons to Syria. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia delivered weapons to Syria in 2017 under a deal made in 2016. Alongside these military maneuvers, Russia has also engaged in humanitarian aid, reconciliation, and rehabilitation work, particularly through its Reconciliation Center at Hmeimim Air Base. According to the center in Aleppo in 2016, they restored infrastructure. including power and water lines, and cleared streets from wreckage. They have also done humanitarian efforts in other parts of the country and been engaged in mine clearance operations. In addition to its engagements on the ground, Russia continues to provide political and diplomatic support to the Syrian government, even in cases where this has undermined civilian protection, human rights, and accountability, and again, despite the extensive record of abuse. Russia has used its veto at the Security Council 11 times to shield its allies in Damascus from condemnation, from sanction, or from referral to the International Criminal Court. Most recently, Russia used its veto to stop the renewal of a joint investigation from the UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, whose job it was to identify the culprits of chemical weapon attacks in Syria. Russia has also been deeply engaged in negotiations to try and end the conflict and to usher in a transitional government, including by helping to broker local surrender or so-called reconciliation agreements, and by spearheading the Astana talks. The Astana talks have centered around creating and implementing de-escalation zones in Syria. They've brought together the Syrian government and anti-government groups, as well as Turkey and Iran, and they did result in concrete agreements. Unfortunately, these agreements were swiftly ignored by the government and anti-government groups on the ground after they were made. And we saw, after these agreements were made, that the government, in fact, launched its operations on Damascus countryside and in Idlib with Russian support, making it impossible to achieve the goals set out in these agreements. In February, Russia announced to host a Syrian National Congress in order to work on the constitution and post-conflict transition. Again, however, very little has come out of this beyond an affirmation of the UN-supported Geneva political process, and a commitment to create a constitutional committee. The Congress has excluded a large part of the population, and as a result, it has been largely ineffective. So what is Russia trying to achieve through its engagement in Syria? At bottom, the Russian government is keen for its allies in Damascus to achieve a military victory over anti-government groups in the country. Critically, this involves retaking territory from armed groups on the ground, even when this has led to disastrous consequences for civilians. At the same time, Russia recognizes that long-term success is dependent on stability and a successful transition to a post-conflict phase. My colleague Sara is going to describe for us in greater detail what the conflict looks like in Syria today, how it has impacted civilians, and then we will share our observations on what Russia should do to try to promote reconstruction, rehabilitation, and fundamentally a successful transition to a post-conflict phase.
Thank you, Lama. Thank you all for being here. So as Lama mentioned, what I'll do is I'll give, before going into what Russia's role is in a sort of post-conflict Syria situation, I want to just take a moment to take stock of what the conflict looks like now, what we're inheriting when we say we want to go into a post-conflict transition. So just as a start, the landscape of the Syrian conflict has actually changed since Russia's intervention. Since 2015, in the last couple of years, the Syrian government has actually retaken large swaths of the country, including Aleppo in 2016 and what we're seeing in Ghouta today, 2018. What this means is that the government is now in control of most of the territory of Syria when it previously had not been. Since the start of the conflict. There are a few pockets that remain. The yellow that you see is the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, and these are primarily made up of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party. The black that you see is what remains of ISIS, and then the green is the anti-government groups. The red is the Syrian government. So you can see that the majority of the territory is back with the Syrian government. But that's not the end of the story. Territorial gains have actually been met with a lot of physical costs as well as human costs. In terms of physical costs, the large-scale destruction of Syrian country is quite clear. I'll give you an example. In July 2017, the World Bank assessed that a third of livable housing in Syria was completely destroyed, and over half of medical and educational facilities no longer exist. Syria had actually lost an estimated $226 billion in GDP, and then $350 billion are required to reconstruct Syria. And that's a huge figure. It's a figure that no one country can actually deal with on its own. But that's not it. Human costs are also staggering. And you know the statistics. There were 20 million people in Syria in 2011. Almost 500,000 of those are now dead. 11 million are either internally displaced or have sought refuge outside of the country. And then you have tens of thousands of people who are detained, disappeared, people whose fate we don't know anything about. And what this means is, I mean, beyond the statistics, it means that the violations that we've witnessed over the past 7 years have been so great that they've cleaved the society in half. So while we're talking about territorial integrity, we need to understand that the human cost of the Syrian conflict is nowhere near being resolved. And the reason I'm referring to this is because these form the root causes of the obstacles to return, to reconstruction, to recovery, to what it means to move to a post-conflict transition. And I'll address this in more detail by discussing the situation in areas that are retaken by the government, which form the majority of the areas that we're discussing now. And they actually form sort of the priority for Russia moving forward, because it has a presence on the ground there, it has influence there. So when the Syrian government decides to retake an area, as Lama said, with Russia's support, it uses a series of unlawful tactics, including withholding humanitarian aid, sieges, and relentless, indiscriminate strikes that don't just target the anti-government military groups, but also target highly populated civilian areas, resulting in absolute disaster for a large number of civilians. We saw this in Aleppo. We're now seeing it in Ghouta. And it's the cause of the large destruction and physical costs that I referenced earlier. But what happens once the Syrian government retakes an area is this thing called a local reconciliation or local surrender agreement. And these are actually often guaranteed by the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they result in a mass exodus of the population, which means that large numbers of the civilian population are displaced from areas that are retaken by the government, and they go to opposition or anti-government held areas. And so as the Syrian government has taken more territory, the anti-government areas are slowly shrinking, and so we're seeing an increased number of a civilian population moving towards Idlib governorate, which is one of the remaining strongholds of the Syrian anti-government groups. Just to give an example of the numbers, in Aleppo, an estimated 35,000 were displaced. In Ghouta, up until April 2nd, a week ago, around 83,000 were displaced. And in the process of displacement, these people don't only lose their homes, but they also lose any property documentation, any ID documentation, making it very difficult for them to be able to return if they want to. But the reality of the situation is that in areas that have been retaken by the government, a lot of the civilians don't feel comfortable returning to areas under Syrian government control. And as a result, the areas that have been retaken by the government have not recovered well, even areas that have been taken 2 or 3 years before. Why is this? Most civilians fear return to control of to areas under the control of the Syrian government for 2 reasons. One is the loss of property and property documentation, which I referenced above. And then the second reason is because they fear that the Syrian government would forcibly conscript them, detain them, or retaliate against them for having lived in anti-government areas. So while, according to the UN Refugee Agency, a little over 500,000 people have already returned voluntarily, many more continue to be displaced. And what we found is that a lot of those returning are women, children, and men above the military age. Men who are of conscription age or who suspect that they may be wanted by the government have foregone return as the shadow of potential arrest, forced conscription, and mistreatment in detention hangs above their heads. And their fears are not unfounded. A recently leaked database of names of people wanted by the Syrian government just topped 1.5 million. That means, if true, 1.5 million people are wanted by the Syrian government of this very same population. The government has also pursued a policy of punishing people who are affiliated with the perceived opposition by detaining them and by prosecuting them and seizing their property, creating a significant barrier to return. They've done this using laws like the Counterterrorism Law of 2012, which criminalizes several neutral acts, including providing humanitarian aid, and Legislative Decree number 63 of 2012, and this empowers the Ministry of Finance to seize assets and property of people who fall under this law. I've personally spoken to several individuals whose property, whose livelihood has been seized under this law, and this constitutes a barrier to return for them. What would they return to? The other reason, in addition to this, is the fact that physical recovery of areas that are retaken by the government is not moving forward. And the reason for this is a policy that the Syrian government has used, where it's required recovery projects to be operationalized through the state or through civil society actors closely tied to the state. As a result, independent NGOs that want to make project determinations based on need and not political considerations are unwilling to work in these areas. The restrictions don't only translate into operational difficulties in terms of reconstruction funds, but they also translate into valid hesitation on the part of donors to become complicit in discriminatory programming, where you reward the loyal instead of basing funds on needs. They're also afraid of providing funds to individuals or corporations for war crimes. So when we're talking about $350 billion that are needed for reconstruction, you don't have a lot of donors that are willing to contribute this to people implicated in human rights or humanitarian violations. So Western states have indicated that they'll participate in reconstruction only when a comprehensive, genuine, and inclusive political transition negotiated by the Syrian parties in the conflict based on the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 is firmly underway. Now, while Russia has made several diplomatic overtures towards this, such as being a guarantor for the local agreements and creating a process in Astana that's parallel to the Geneva one, a political transition, a return of the displaced, reconstruction, recovery, these are very, very remote goals in Syria. And this provides us with a good sort of segue to talk about what Russia actually needs to do to get to this phase. So first and foremost, Russia needs to rehabilitate trust from the local population and from states who are willing to reconstruct. There are three principal ways that Russia could do this. And while this is in no way comprehensive, we've sort of landed on these three priorities precisely because we feel like if progress is made on these, then we've gone a long way towards a better situation within Syria. The first is to promote accountability and compliance with the laws of war and military operations. And I say this with a reminder that Russia is militarily involved in Syria and partially responsible for those violations. And as Lama said, Syrian and Russian joint military operations have indiscriminately struck civilians. They've used prohibited weapons. Russia's involvement and its provision of cover for the Syrian government in doing this has damaged its standing with the population and with the international community. To allow the pursuit of accountability for these violations would go a very long way, not only in allowing the society and the population to recover from the damage inflicted by 7 years of the war, but also to show that Russia's ability to pursue a stable post-conflict transition in Syria is there, and to attract reconstruction funding, very pragmatically. So a few recommendations on this end. Russia should not use its veto at the UN Security Council to block referrals to the ICC for war crimes, which it has done before, or to block attribution of responsibility for the use of chemical weapons, which it did when it vetoed the renewal of the mandate of the Joint Investigative Mechanism. Russia should also seize the use of incendiary and cluster munitions in Syria and urge the Syrian government to stop using them. I say this, it sounds very straightforward, but we haven't seen this happen yet. And then Russia should also be more transparent about its operations and and the specific strikes it's responsible for, and then provide timely and adequate compensation to victims of unlawful strikes. And finally, it should urge the Syrian government to provide unimpeded humanitarian access to areas based on need and allow necessary material including medical equipment. The other overarching priority that we landed on is building confidence through promoting detainee rights. And we spoke about abuse in detention, enforced disappearances as one of the most widespread violations that we've seen in the Syrian conflict, but they also constitute a root cause of the uprising and a key deterrent to return. Hundreds of thousands are detained or disappeared in Syria today. And the impact of this on people contemplating return and society more broadly cannot be underestimated. So the good thing is that Russia has actually started working on this through the Astana process, through the detentions working group that it had created. It had taken some steps to address the issue of detentions, and it recognizes it as a key confidence-building measure. Unfortunately, this is not enough. It's not up to the scale of the detentions problem. So a few additional recommendations. Russia should urge the working group to reveal information about the fate and whereabouts of detainees, but also push for the release of arbitrarily held persons and for access to independent monitors to places of detention. It should also push for the creation of an independent commission to review cases of those detained, monitor their treatment in detention, and ensure their release. The commission should be granted access to all detention facilities. And the reason we refer to a commission is because there has to be an independent actor that's able to take stock of the detentions issue. And that's not happened yet. And it's not enough for the working group to take this on. The Russian government should also urge Syria to repeal or reform laws that criminalize the exercise of rights to peaceful expression, assembly, and association. And these are protections that should have been there in the first place, but their lack thereof has resulted in a large number of detainees. So when we say tens of thousands, we're also talking about protesters, about students, about people who are exercising these rights and who weren't able to in Syria. Finally, the third overarching principle is promoting non-discriminatory distribution of recovery assistance and elimination of barriers for returnees. So we talked about Western donors being hesitant to fund post-conflict reconstruction. And we talked about the issue of displacement and how difficult it is for returnees, for people to return. And the idea is for recovery to be sustainable, all segments of the population need to benefit, with priorities based on need rather than perceived loyalty. For both donors and international organizations that are operating in recovery and reconstruction to be able to invest and contribute, they need guarantees that they're, one, not furthering violations of international law or being complicit with them. And then two, they need to ensure that the funding that goes into recovery is not wasted, is not misappropriated, is not used for political reasons that are not based on needs. A few recommendations on this. Access and transparency. This will facilitate the delivery of aid in a non-discriminatory way. It will also safeguard against funds going to entities, individuals, officials, or subcontractors that have been involved in human rights or humanitarian violations. Russia should also urge the Syrian government to repeal problematic legislation, like the counterterrorism law that we had spoken about, the one that's so broad that almost everything falls under it. And this keeps civilians from returning. And then finally, and this is a short to medium term recommendation that's essential, especially in areas that are being retaken as we speak, Russia should allow and support the deployment of UN monitors to areas retaken by the government, because this provides a buffer against retaliation. It provides an independent oversight over how the evacuations are happening, and it deters further violations that we've documented in other areas that have been retaken. I know these recommendations aren't easy. These overarching principles are actually quite complex, especially given the dynamics. But if we are to discuss a post-conflict transition seriously, if we are going to discuss the future of Syria in a way that allows the civilian population to live well, these are minimum requirements at this point. And I look forward to discussing them further with you. Thank you.
Спасибо огромное.
Thanks a lot. And as a moderator, I would ask one question. The first one, I would like our colleagues to talk a little bit on what the role of or the situation looks like for the Human Rights Watch in terms of access to Syria. When did the organization worked on the field on the ground for the last time? And whereas there is a problem with access, how can the organization overcome those barriers and get information from the territory of Syria?
Thanks, Tanya. So Human Rights Watch has been accessing territory in Syria to conduct investigations since 2011. And when we access an area, we have to do so with the permission of the government or the entity that is in control of that area. So we have applied for visas from the Syrian government repeatedly. On 2 instances, they issued visas for staff. I participated in those 2 missions, traveled to Latakia and to Damascus and Homs to conduct investigations. When we have conducted investigations in territory under the control of anti-government armed groups, we have also had to coordinate to get access to those territories, often through Turkey or through Iraq. Because of the, once ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, increased the scope of their territorial control, it became more and more difficult for us to operate in those areas because of the kidnapping and execution risks. I'm sure you're all aware of the humanitarians and journalists that were kidnapped by those groups. So we continued to conduct operations in areas where we felt that it was secure enough for us to do so. I also participated in operations, for example, in Raqqa, when Raqqa first fell to the anti-government groups. We have gone to areas also held by Kurdish forces, most recently in January. So we do continue to try to get access, and we do have limited access, but it is incredibly difficult, particularly to access areas that are held by the government forces when we don't get those visas. So we have to rely on a network of contacts on the ground. We have to rely on remote interviewing, and then we have to rely on other pieces of evidence. The use of satellite imagery, the use of photographic and video evidence, speaking to individuals who have left the country, using medical reports, legal documents, looking for a range of evidence to try to corroborate the testimonies that we are getting on the ground, and then maintaining lines of communications with people in affected areas across the country. So it's imperfect, but we do have a number of tools at our disposal to corroborate the violations that we are documenting.
Господа,
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, whatever questions or comments you have, please, but introduce yourself, please.
Good evening. My name is Elsa. I represent Oxfam in Russia, and we are also very committed to trying to contribute to a humanitarian solution and thinking of post-conflict. But speaking of areas that have recently been retaken by government forces, I'm very interested in the fate of the people who choose or do not choose to leave the area. Can you be a little bit more specific on how the choice is being made, how freely it is, how it is operated? Is it based on lists? Is it by chance? If you can elaborate on that, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a good question to sort of start off with. So, I mean, what we've seen, for example, in Ghouta, it's basically, it differs according to what the agreement is and what the situation is like, and even the specific town. What I'll start by saying is that usually what you see, and this could differ, is that they negotiate the agreement. Usually it's fighters and their families, and then whichever civilian decides to go. The sort of the problem or the concerns that we have with regards to the situation is what's happening in the process of retaking an area. When you're talking about indiscriminate and relentless bombardment, no humanitarian aid, it's not a livable situation, right? So we say people may choose to leave, but there are concerns about how that choice is made, in what context, or whether it actually constitutes a choice. Then the other concern is with regards to the people who choose to remain. Often what we've seen and we've documented in the past is extrajudicial executions, retaliatory acts. What also happens is that you almost immediately lose contact with people who decide to remain in Syrian government areas because they're concerned for their fate. From people that I have spoken to in areas that have been retaken, there's a concern with regards to humanitarian access. These areas are often ignored. Men of conscription age have almost disappeared. So you see all of these things moving together. The final point that I'd make on this question is the question of destination. Where do these people go when and if they decide to leave? So as I mentioned, most of them go to anti-government groups, areas held by anti-government groups. But that means also that these areas, such as, for example, Idlib, has a large concentration of civilians who are unaffiliated with fighters, but are all effectively trapped into this governorate, with Turkey having closed the border. So there's nowhere else for them to go. And that's something that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at how the conflict is ending, if it's even ending. That's something, that's a concern that we've had, and it's something that we've documented. A lot of the people who are displaced from areas that have been retaken by the government have actually been bombarded again in other areas. They've lost their secondary homes, their third homes. They've been subject to displacement multiple times. And where do these people go? I mean, that's the question.
Just to add a couple points to that. So one of the things that we've heard, for example, in Damascus, in the context of the fighting there, is that some people do want to go to the government-held territory from the countryside. But there are actually some administrative mechanisms in place that keep them from doing so. So for example, to rent a property in Damascus, you need to get the permission of the security forces to be, the security intelligence to be able to do that. So if they don't give you that permission, then you have to leave from that housing. So there are administrative ways that the government is controlling who's moving into areas under their control. And Sara touched on this, but I think it's worth echoing that all of the neighboring states now to Syria have effectively closed their borders to refugees. So people have very limited options for where they're going. And we have increasing concern about the humanitarian situation in Idlib. precisely because this has been the dumping ground for all displaced persons from other areas that have been retaken by the government. From a humanitarian perspective, there are significant concerns about adequate housing, access to water, access to medical assistance, food, but also these are areas that are, again, being subjected to these indiscriminate aerial attacks. And we only expect that that's going to increase. So the movements are not free and voluntary.
Good afternoon. Russian service of the Voice of America today. There is a meeting at the UN Security Council on Syria. Two aspects are being discussed, including the chemical attacks. Russia, Moscow has said on a number of occasions that in Syria, a provocation was being organized that non-government forces, anti-government forces, use chemical weapons rather than the government. What do you think about this problem, and can we hope that there will be cooperation with Russia on Syria, given that it has been blocking all resolutions on Syria?
For your question. We are still in the process of investigating the most recent reported chemical attack in Ghouta. What we do know is that there have been dozens of chemical attacks in Syria, most of which have been perpetrated by the government. We have documented the government's use of Syrian, which is a nerve agent, in Khan Sheikhoun, but also in Ghouta in 2013, and a couple of other places in Idlib and Hama countryside, and the extensive use of chlorine. And the use of chlorine in a central way as part of operations to retake territory held by anti-government groups. So unfortunately, there is this strong precedent of government use of chemical weapons and a lack of accountability or deterrence measures that have been put in place to punish them as a result. We have also documented use of chemical weapons by ISIS, both inside Syria and in Iraq. The area where these attacks happened is not an area where ISIS is present. We continue to be very concerned about the situation in Douma. We have begun preliminary investigations that indicate that there were a large number of civilians that were impacted. Initial indications are through a chemical agent. More investigation needs to be undertaken. But the attack on Douma is not the first attack, even since the Khan Sheikhoun attack of April last year, where we saw the Syrian government deploy sarin through a warplane. And currently today, there is no UN mechanism to investigate responsibility for chemical attacks in Syria. There is no mechanism by which victims can get accountability for being subjected to these heinous weapons. And we are looking to the Security Council to fulfill its responsibility to Syria, but also to the rule of law, and to renew the joint investigative mechanism that would be allowed to investigate responsibility for chemical attacks. If that doesn't happen, then the UN Secretary General should act. And he should, of his own volition, reappoint this mechanism. What we have seen in Syria when it comes to the use of prohibited weapons, but also conventional weapons, is that there are no red lines. That there continue to be impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, without unified international action, which has effectively given a green light to perpetrators on the ground. And that's the case for the government, but it's also the case for other groups on the ground which are perpetrating rights violations.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria, ICRC. I have a couple of questions. First, in respect to the aerial attacks, because you mentioned that both in respect to US-led attacks and Russian-led attacks, they're indiscriminate in a way targeting the civilians. My question is to what extent it relates to, in general, the problematics of distinction when using the warfare in the densely populated areas, or it is a deliberate sort of a targeting of the civilians in these areas. And my second question is that, given that Russia is extremely unlikely to support any international criminal court-led investigations, given that there is case on Ukraine, like preliminary investigation on Georgia, do you think that at any moment, at any extent, the local court system, probably with a bit of internationalized element, with a push from the outside, can somehow cope with the accountability and being in the same time impartial enough to help in post-conflict transition? Thank you.
So on the question of distinction versus, is it a problem of distinction or is it a problem of targeted attacks? We have documented instances where we believe Syrian government forces have directly targeted civilians. And in fact, there are a pattern of these attacks. And so, for example, directly targeted bloodlines. There are a number of instances where we've documented the repeated striking of hospitals, marked hospitals, places where the government knew this was a civilian object. So that is something that unfortunately has become characteristic in this conflict. There is also the problem of distinction, the use of weapons that are incapable of being precise in populated areas, and that's cluster, munitions, that's incendiary weapons, barrel bombs in these populated areas, as well as ballistic missiles. So missiles that have a very wide area effect in a densely populated area. In many cases, when we conduct these investigations, individuals in the area cannot identify for us any military objectives. And when they can, it's clear that in many cases the attacks still appear to be disproportionate. That the military objective was actually not outweighed by the civilian cost of the attack. So unfortunately, both of those things are very present. In terms of accountability, the Russian government, along with the Chinese government, have effectively stopped accountability through the UN Security Council. But the rest of the world still has a responsibility. And the UN General Assembly has stepped up in maybe an improbable way, an unprecedented way, and established a mechanism. It's called the IIIM, which is tasked now with creating case files for future war crimes prosecutions. It's not clear where that information is going to go today. There is no Syria War Crimes Tribunal. That's something that may come in the future. Right now, it is critical that there are these measures taken to preserve evidence and to create these case files, because people will forget, evidence will degrade. So that's going to be a critical avenue for future accountability. Some states in Europe are also pursuing universal jurisdiction. So prosecutions of members of anti-government groups, but also government forces who make their way into Europe or who have dual nationalities. And that allows them to prosecute for atrocity crimes, even though those crimes were not perpetrated in Europe. So that's a second avenue. In the north of Syria, you also have this, autonomous Kurdish government that has developed. And they have their own court system, and they are holding a number of ISIS detainees, hundreds of ISIS detainees, including foreign fighters. There is still a question about how accountability will move forward for those abuses, some of the most heinous abuses we've seen in the context of the conflict. Right now, looking at those courts are not capable of giving fair trials. So there is really an open question of how that's going to move forward, and additional support that needs to go to ensure that people are given fair trials, but that people are held responsible. I don't hold out much hope or faith that we're going to see trials through Syrian domestic processes, but of course, if there is going to be a true transition, there will also need to be a revamping of the judicial process within the government and of the judiciary.
Я Олег Орлов.
I'm Oleg Orlov from the Human Rights Center of Memorial. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I have several questions. The first question, in fighting for Raqqa, when it was liberated from ISIS control, as I understand, this was done mostly by the Syrian Democratic Forces. To what extent during this fighting was there a mass killing or mass death of civilian population? On the chemical weapons, you said that you have documented cases of the use of chemical weapons by the government forces and by ISIS. Does that mean that other cases have not been documented by you, or that the possibility of the use of chemical weapons by other parties to the civil war is in question, is under question? What is the methodology that Human Rights Watch uses in order to establish responsibility for the use of chemical weapons by a particular party?
So on your question about Raqqa, so Raqqa was retaken through a combination of aerial attacks by the US-led coalition and on the ground by the Syrian Democratic Forces. There has been widespread displacement as a result of the fighting in Raqqa, as well as extensive destruction of civilian property. We have documented cases where civilians were killed by the US-led coalition in the context of bombings there. Some cases where we believe the attacks may actually have been unlawful. In those cases, we have written to the coalition, asked them to investigate the attacks, and the response to to those requests has not always been sufficient. So we are continuing to look at coalition responsibility for civilian casualties in the context of the Raqqa offensive. Sarah's actually going to be going into the area to conduct those kinds of investigations in the coming weeks. But critically, in the post-ISIS phase, one of the key questions is going to be, who is going to take responsibility for reconstructing these areas which have been devastated. These are also areas where you have improvised explosive devices or landmines that have been left by ISIS that need to be cleared. Civilians continue to die and be injured by these weapons on the ground. You have bodies that are under rubble and mass graves. People need to be identified. And the infrastructure needs to be totally rebuilt. So again, I think there is a question here of what kind of engagement can we expect and see from coalition actors that have been responsible for a lot of this destruction there, and would facilitate fundamentally allowing civilians to return. Civilians that have fled from Raqqa and from Deir ez-Zor into areas that are under the control of Syrian Democratic Forces have described to us abuses that they've suffered by those forces, including arbitrary detention, mistreatment in detention, and restrictions on the movement of displaced persons. So I'm from Deir ez-Zor, but I have family in Tabqa outside of Raqqa, but I'm not allowed to go there because it's under Kurdish control. They make me go to an area that's held by the Arab anti-government groups. So those restrictions on freedom of movement are also unlawful. On the question of chemical weapons, we said ISIS, not other groups. We've recently put out a document identifying 85 confirmed chemical weapons attacks, consolidating the investigations that have been done by ourselves and UN actors and a few other sort of key independent sources. In that data set of 85 attacks, there was one other attack that was identified by an anti-government group that hasn't been documented by us. That isn't to say that there are not more attacks. These are just the attacks that we know of. In terms of how we identify responsibility or our methodology, in conducting investigations on chemical weapons use, we look to a multitude of sources. We want to speak to people that saw the attack when it happened. We want to speak with the first responders who can describe to us the symptoms that they saw. We want to see the physical evidence, the video and the photographic evidence of the remnant. In some cases, samples have been taken out, understanding the findings of those samples. Using this sort of whole body of evidence to put together a case, to analyze, to see who had the capability to conduct this type of attack, who had the weapon, this type of weapon in their stockpile, what direction did the attack come from. Based on the deployment of the attack, it also can give a lot of indications of who is responsible for the attack. So for example, in the Khan Shaykhun attack, there were sentries that identified the warplane that left from the Syrian base, that then dropped the munition, that landed in the village where we spoke with the residents who described the chemical exposure. The Syrian government, the anti-government groups in that area don't have warplanes, so it also limits the responsibility. In the context of the Ghouta attack, we were able to, based on the munition, identify the direction that the munition came from and the flight trajectory, the length of possibility flight trajectory, to be able to identify what territory it could have come from, and it came from government-held territory. The weapons identification is also key. In the Ghouta attack from 2013, we identified that this was a weapon, Iranian-produced weapon that was known to be in the stockpile of the Syrian government. So these are all different indications. We, in all of these instances, have not been able to conduct on-the-ground investigations. We've conducted remote investigations. With Khan Shaykhun, for example, I interviewed the injured in Turkey. They had come out to Turkey and interviewed them there. We've interviewed some people in Damascus as well, that have come from Damascus into Beirut. It's a combination of using different tools to build the case. And when we feel that we have enough evidence to credibly point to a perpetrator, that's when we do so.
More questions, please.
Polina Ivanova from Reuters. I don't know if this is necessarily an appropriate question for you guys, but very interested to hear what you think Russia's role in Syria's reconstruction will be, in your opinion. What signs are you seeing of this already? Also, what role you think Russia intends to play in Syria's economy going forward?
So what we know so far in terms of Russia's role in in reconstructing Syria and the economy, they've already some Russian companies have already made commitments to primarily the energy, commerce, and agricultural sectors. They've made commitments, but we haven't seen any investments yet. On the diplomatic front, we are seeing signs that Russia's sort of trying to roll back the sanctions regime against the Syrian government. There is recognition that Russian corporations or the Russian state cannot alone, or even with China and Iran, support the reconstruction of Syria. And that recognition is sort of propelling a lot of the diplomatic efforts. In terms of what we hope for Russia's role to be in Syria moving forward, primarily around what kind of precursors or prerequisites need to be in place before reconstruction or post-conflict transition takes place. And this relates to what I mentioned earlier with regards to accountability, non-discriminatory funding, not rewarding the loyal, and punishing people who are perceived to be with opposition. And these are actually, they're also prerequisites for the removal of the sanctions regime. So that's something to keep in mind.
Hi, my name is Ekaterina. I'm a reporter for TV Rain. You mentioned on your presentation that Kurdish fighters harassed some staff and activists. And can you please briefly explain what's their role in the conflict and what you saw in Syria?
Sure. So within the northeast, you have different Kurdish political actors. The sort of largest opposition Kurdish party is the KDP, and the ruling Kurdish party is the PYD. So the current administration that is in place is a PYD-led administration. It is affiliated with the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And we have documented cases in which the PYD has arrested opposition Kurds, so members of the KDP. And this can be for freedom of expression issues, for trying to build up their own militia, put their Peshmerga in the area, for speaking out, for protests, a range of, they are targeting them for a range of legitimate activities. And, what we've seen is, over time, the PYD has expanded its area of control. They have been fighting ISIS to retake this territory. This has, extended now from the border with Iraq up until Afrin, which is in Aleppo countryside. Afrin is the area, of course, that the Turkish government has recently conducted the offensive to retake Afrin district and push these Kurdish forces back to the east. The PYD-led government is not an anti-government, anti-Syrian government political party. They are a pro-Kurdish political party. They are an anti-ISIS fighting force, but they do not have an active front against the Syrian government. So there is a question as to what will happen to these PYD-led areas in a transition phase. To what extent will they continue to be able to administer themselves and have control over local governance? People make parallels between what is happening in Syria and the situation in Iraq, and would they have that kind of level of autonomy or control? I think we don't know yet at this stage. But it is not an entity that is anti-government. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind.
Hi, Andrew Roth for The Guardian, and to listen to the kind of information that you're giving today.
Naturally, all the information that Human Rights Watch gathers, all the findings of the organization are available in public domain. And we actually make sure to send all of our reports and recommendations to Russian authorities. We've been sending numerous letters to the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation and the Ministry of Defense. I would say that our dialogue with the Ministry of Defense has been, well, rather disappointing, and I'm being euphemistic here, meaning that we barely get any responses from them except very angry comments, mostly from the press service, not addressed directly to us, but again, kind of public angry comments and rebuttals, and they mostly amount to things like, well, Human Rights Watch does not know what it's talking about, this information is completely false. As regards the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation, we had a little more success in that respect. We've been exchanging letters, and we do hope to get a high-level meeting at the Foreign Ministry in the near future, not on this particular visit, most unfortunately, but we are seeking a meeting with Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Bogdanov, his deputy in charge of the MENA region. I think personally that now, given that Russia is interested in playing an important role in post-conflict reconstruction, we could get some traction with the Russian authorities, even if for the reason that they would be simply interested in our insights and expertise, given that we've done so much field research in the area. But And we wish I could say something more positive about our engagement with the Russian authorities. Frankly, it's been very complicated, and the given political climate is not exactly playing in our favor.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, we would like to engage more. Yes. So, you know, we have received some responses to correspondence, for example, like on cluster munitions, but the vast majority of correspondence, unfortunately, is not responded to. We will continue to put out requests for meetings, and, you know, to the extent that that's forthcoming, we'll explore that. You know, you can't talk about a future Syria without talking about the role of Russia. Russia is going to be a critical player in long-term stability in Syria. So we recognize that, and we want to be able to have that dialogue with them. You know, Sarah recently met with the Russian representative to the UN mission in New York that is working on the Middle East and North Africa. You know, we are hoping in the course of our time here we're going to have additional engagement with the Russian authorities. But it has been difficult to have that discussion. In some cases, they'll respond to the reporting publicly. You know, when we documented an attack on a school in Has and Idlib, the Russian Ministry of Defense responded publicly to the reporting, and that's always welcome. You know, we want to hear the other side as well.
More questions, please. Oh, well, then we can thank our speakers for having come to Moscow today. Let's thank our interpreters who have given us a chance to talk in such a brilliant way. We will thank the Memorial once again very cordially for this event. We hope that in the nearest future we will hold other events and lectures and discussions of this kind, and I have little doubt that my colleagues who are in Russia for the first time, they will be coming to Russia within the year to come. And I would like to tell the journalists who are here, Lama and Sara can talk to you separately if you need some help with interpreting. I will help you with that. And thanks a lot once again. I hope it's been interesting for you. Thanks a lot.